Brook High School. Any alumni from Brook? Okay. Within his 12-year teaching career, he has also taught the NFTE entrepreneurship course, letters.
Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship.
Okay. As well as a course he developed entitled African Americans in Philadelphia, affectionately renamed Black Philly, by his students at Delaware Valley Charter High School in 2011. Today's ETA presenter has taught in the University of Pennsylvania's Upward Bound program, catering to Philadelphia high school students for the past 5 years. Additionally, he has taught in the PASSET program at Temple University, Philadelphia Freedom Schools, and the Military Veterans Upward Bound program of University of Pennsylvania. Akil also currently teaches math as an adjunct professor for corporate college services. Much of his historical and cultural awareness has been facilitated by membership in organizations such as ASCAC, which is the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, the AAPRP, which is the African People's Revolutionary Party, and AHSA, which is the African Heritage Studies Association. He has had the opportunity to present papers on various educational topics at conferences held by these organizations as well. He is a firm believer in the urgency and the necessity of creating independent African-centered institutions addressing every aspect of the existence of African people, as this will be the only true solution to our collective problems. In addition to teaching and mentoring, he is currently working on multiple books, one of which is on urban education. Ladies and gentlemen, ETA members, visitors, family, our presenter today, Brother Akil.
Thank you. If I could have permission from the elders to continue.
You may.
Thank you. So this presentation, I was talking to my father about this earlier today, that this kind of presentation has been in my head for like the last 2 or 3 years, but I've never actually documented these thoughts. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to present these for you, and also to organize my thoughts more on Pan-Africanism and how it can manifest itself in the classroom. Like even in Philadelphia public school classrooms, which are not meant to be Pan-Africanist spaces, but those of us that want to embrace Pan-Africanism, there are things that we can do, the things that I attempt to do, and I just want to share some of those things. So let me start with a definition, a working definition of Pan-Africanism. And usually I like to print things out, but my printer was acting up, so I promise you I'm not on the internet. I'm actually looking at my presentation right now. But anyway, Pan-Africanism, a political objective seeking to unify all indigenous inhabitants of the African continent, as well as those throughout the African diaspora. All right. So I'm going to read from this, but also I'm going to ad-lib at certain points. I've been a teacher. That I actually need to update that introduction or that bio. I've been a teacher in the Philadelphia public school system for 13 years at this point, and this time I've taught and encountered a multitude of students that were continental Africans and also born in the Caribbean islands. Earlier on in my teaching career, when I was more of a company man, I didn't understand the significance of this, just as I didn't understand the significance of Pan-Africanism in itself. It's my belief that as was in the bio, it's my belief that all the political, economic, and social ills that plague the Black or African community can be alleviated by a full embracing of Pan-Africanism. Under Pan-Africanism, people of African descent will have control over land and resources, and in turn have the power to live in a healthy manner in accordance with our own cultural norms and imperatives. But let me also be clear in that stating that Pan-Africanism will not create a utopia. Right? Because I know a lot of detractors will always say, "Oh, you want a utopia." It's not about creating a utopia, but it will give us an opportunity to have some different types of problems. We can have problems that those groups that have power have, and that's a different type of problem. And I would prefer for us to have these types of problems. With this being said, elders in the community, myself included, should attempt to take advantage of any and all opportunities to embrace and promote Pan-Africanism whenever possible. Even if our children currently attend Eurocentric, white supremacist, neo-colonial schools, these spaces can still be a wellspring for Pan-Africanist activity until we create a vast network of independent African-centered schools. One method of achieving this is to, in both explicit and as well as implicit ways, to impress upon black students that think they're just from North Philly, or think they're just from West Philly or from Uptown, that they are in fact from Africa. There will be resistance, just as there was in the movie Boys in the Hood that came out over 20 years ago, when Trey told his friend that they were all from Africa, and a fight ensued because his friend said, "No, I'm from Crenshaw Mafia," and then he called Trey an African booty scratcher, and then Trey ends up getting into a fight with him. I think that as educators, and this is one of the things I'm still working through, we can appeal to the ego of the youth and let them know that their hatred and also the lack of concern for Africa, and this is something that Malcolm X talked about in some of his speeches, is really due to it's part of an intergenerational con game, where that a lot of us have been hustled at. Due to an awareness on the part of Europeans, Arabs, and Asians of the wealth, the riches, and the natural resources that the African continent holds, we're tricked into hating Africa so that we will not attempt to claim all those riches and wealth for ourselves. And this essentially is the con game. Simply put, it's akin to a family that has the best house on the block. They get evicted from it, and subsequently they're forced to live in squalor around the corner. And while being told that their house is actually trash, while everyone else knows how great it is and covets it. It is as if they've been programmed to forget how great their house was when they lived there. And in the meantime, those that evicted them are able to enjoy the comfort, the amenities, and the spaciousness of the house. We have to empower our children with appropriate knowledge so they will not be hustled in this way, in this geopolitical con game, like I say. Even if we classify ourselves as African Americans or Africans in America, we're still linked culturally to Africa and should want to be. As Jacob Carruthers once stated, I don't think any of our ancestors walked off of any slave ship saying that they were Americans now at that point. And thus no longer linked to Africa. Many of our ancestors worked feverishly to maintain the linkages to the African continent, and there are many others still doing this work currently. If we can provide accurate information about the continent and about Africa, that will make a young person want to connect to it, and they would. We also can expose the contradiction of how, again, something else Malcolm X talked about, the contradiction of how if Africa is so dejected and so unwanted, then the question can be asked as to why do so many Europeans, Asians, and Arabs, why are they so interested in traveling there and setting up businesses there and so forth? The fact of the matter is that despite all of the infomercials we've grown up watching that solicit donations, Africa, in fact, does not suffer from a lack of resources. It suffers from imperialism and neo-colonialism, which through physical violence and also, through military strength and cultural violence, concentrates the wealth in the hands of outside exploiters. Once we study the African cultural norms, we will be able to show the youth how many of their so-called American practices and behaviors can actually be traced back to our motherland. But again, the ultimate solution is the creation of independent African-centered schools that would normalize the realities of the continent and its potential. So the realities of how great it once was, how great it could be, but also be honest about the reasons for the problems that plague the continent right now. In the current Eurocentric schools, Africa and its descendants are viewed and regarded as a cultural other. This is something that Marimba Ani talks about in Yoruba, the cultural other, which makes one experience cognitive dissonance anytime you consider the land and its people in a positive light. So we have to just work through that. So that's some ideas for how to engage students just from Philly, just born in Philly, moms from Philly, grandmom, grandparents and everything. But in terms of engaging continental Africans, I think teachers should be explicit in their embracing of their home country in a positive light. Because I find that a lot of the students that as a means of assimilation, in order to be comfortable, in order to fit into these American spaces, a lot of them will try to downplay their heritage. They'll their names, they'll try to adopt, and I think it's a survival tactic. They want to fit in. You don't want to be seen as weird or different. And I think that's normal. But I think what the teacher can do is try to get them to embrace their names, embrace their cultural practices, embrace the foods that they eat, embrace the countries that they're from. It says Pan-Africanism is the key. Then one of the things we can do is we can highlight Pan-Africanist leaders from those nations. Students from Ghana, for example, they could be, if they're not already, they could be introduced to Osajifo Kwame Nkrumah, or J. Casely Hayford, or Joseph P. Dankwa, one of Nkrumah's teachers, or Yaa Asantewaa. even prior to the establishment of that fought against the